John Henry and the Inky-Poo is exceptionally interesting and slightly disturbing in a very emotional and moving way. This is something that I've only seen in part. I can't find a full version of this anywhere, but I have seen the bulk of it, including the ending, which is the most impactful. So there will be a spoiler here because I kind of need to discuss the thing that makes this really quite powerful. But I also want to discuss John Henry as well, in case you are not aware of who he is. I certainly wasn't. But this is a 1946 stop motion short directed by George Pal, with Pal's Puppetoon style. I'm not the biggest fan of Puppetoons, and to be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of the style of this, but it does actually really work for the storytelling aspect. This was actually nominated for the Best Academy Short, the Best Animated Short in 1946, and that's why I watched this. That's why I discovered this. I'm still trying to watch all of the nominees, and I can definitely see why it was nominated. So the puppetry style, first of all, before I get in with the narrative, is clunky, but if you're a fan of Puppetoon style, you will enjoy it. It is quintessential Puppetoons. All of the characters have really detailed facial expressions. The level of effort that's clearly gone into making these puppets is incredible. So even though it's not my personal favourite style of puppetry, or indeed animation, I can see why it works and I can see that it is a quality example of that craft. The narrative itself is very moving. So this is actually about the folk hero John Henry. I hadn't heard of him, but he was an African American who was tasked with helping to build the tracks of a steel railway. I'm clearly not explaining this very well. I'm only very vaguely, roughly familiar with it, but basically, he was building this railroad. He was fighting against a machine. This machine was putting in these, hammering in these steel drills, or drilling in these bolts, and he, being a very tall man and a very strong man, was challenged to do it alongside and kind of have a race with this machine. And as folklore has it, he beat the machine. He did a better performance than this machine. He got to the end first, which is impressive. But he then died immediately after, according to this animation, at the scene because of the stress on his heart, which is pretty incredible. I think what makes this most interesting is the fact, because that in itself is not overly interesting, man versus machine. If man has to go to the strength of beating the machine, of course their heart's going to give out at some point. But what makes it really interesting is that he was very tall, very powerful. He was formerly enslaved, which obviously gives him more of an, I want to say interesting backstory. That's not necessarily the right word to use, but it gives him more character, gives him more of a reason behind his strength as well, both mental and physical, which makes him more interesting to think about. And this is represented in this short, which is about 7 minutes. And just towards the end, when it's announced that he's dead, they're just like, John Henry's dead. And it's the most dramatic thing I've ever seen in puppetry. And it really kind of moved me because I wasn't expecting it, of course. It wasn't something that I knew was going to happen because I hadn't heard of this. So I actually found it quite moving. I didn't cry. I wasn't that emotionally disturbed by it, but it's quite powerful, and I can see why it was nominated. Um, Interestingly, John Henry is apparently a true story. There was a lot of I did some research after it because I was, it made me really curious about it, which is a good thing. If an animation can make you want to look into something in more detail, it's done a good job. And I did look into John Henry, and apparently there is evidence that he was a real person and that this is a real story. I'm sure, even if that's the case, I'm sure there are maybe twists to the tale that have happened over the years. But that was pretty interesting, and I think it was a really interesting way of telling the story, and it worked quite well. So if you haven't seen it, give it a watch. If you can find the full thing, let me know. But somebody very kindly uploaded most of it to YouTube. If you know anywhere I can see the full thing, let me know. But I thought it was pretty good. I don't think it should have won that year. There were some pretty strong entries, but in all, I was pretty moved by it. it's the first Puppetoons cartoon that I've seen where I kind of thought, actually, I do kind of like this. Whereas the rest of the Puppetoons just don't really speak to me and they're not really my style. But John Henry and the Inky-Poo, definitely something that's worth watching.